I found an invoice on my grandmother's kitchen table charging her $475,000 for raising me. My own parents wrote it. They thought she was alone and easy to frighten. They never imagined the quiet nurse would read the fine print or what my grandfather hid 25 years ago. Before we jump back into today's story, I have some exciting news. We have officially launched a brand new channel called Tales Beneath Skin. If you can't get enough of juicy Reddit drama, this is exactly what you've been waiting for. We're sharing the wildest real stories from real people, featuring insane relationship drama, unbelievable family feuds, and epic revenge. And we never leave you hanging. We track down every single update and plot twist so you get the complete story and the final resolution all in one place. Make sure to subscribe to Tales Beneath Skin right now so you don't miss out. You'll find the link in the video description, the pinned comment, and the collaboration tag. Now, back to the story. I had worked a 13-hour night shift in the pediatric ICU, and all I wanted was to drink my grandmother's bad coffee and sit in a kitchen that smelled like lemon dish soap and old fabric. That was the only plan I had for that Tuesday morning. I remember it clearly because I remember how ordinary it was. I parked my little Corolla in the gravel beside Ruth's house, the same house I'd grown up in, and I let myself in through the side door the way I had 10,000 times since I was 4 years old. My scrubs still smelled faintly of antiseptic, my feet ached. I had a granola bar in my pocket that I never ended up eating. "Grandma," I called out, "I brought your prescription." She didn't answer right away, which wasn't strange. Ruth was 79, and her hearing had started to slip in the last couple of years, though she'd rather have walked into traffic than admit it. I set the little white pharmacy bag on the counter, hung my keys on the hook by the stove, the hook my grandfather installed before I was born, and that was when I saw it. There was a stack of papers on the kitchen table, not Ruth's usual clutter of crossword books and seed catalogs and church bulletins. This was a neat, stapled document, the kind that had been printed on a real printer with real toner, sitting square in the middle of the table where she ate every meal. I shouldn't have read it. It wasn't mine. But the word at the top caught my eye before I could decide to be polite, and once I read that word, I couldn't stop. Invoice. I picked it up. My hands were already tired from 12 hours of charting and IV lines, and the paper trembled a little in my grip, though that might have been the paper and might have been me. Statement of costs incurred in the care, housing, feeding, education, and general raising of the minor child, Delia Marsh. The minor child? Me. I was 28 years old, standing in my scrubs in my grandmother's kitchen, reading a bill that referred to my own childhood as a line item. I kept reading because I think a part of my brain refused to believe what the rest of it already understood. It was itemized. That's the detail that still makes my stomach turn when I think about it. Whoever made it had sat down and broken my entire childhood into categories with dollar amounts beside them, the way you'd price out a kitchen renovation. Housing and utilities, ages 4 through 18, $186,000. Food and clothing, $94,500. Private tutoring, lessons, and educational support, $61,000. Medical, dental, and incidental care, $38,000. Transportation, $29,500. General supervision, emotional labor, and parental services, $66,000. At the bottom in bold with a double underline like an accountant's flourish, total amount due, $475,000. And below that, a sentence I have memorized the way you memorize a scar. Payment is requested within 60 days. Please remit to G. Hale. Failure to resolve this matter may require formal legal action and reassessment of current living arrangements. G. Hale, Gregory Hale, my stepfather. I heard a sound and turned, and my grandmother was standing in the hallway doorway in her housecoat, her white hair flat on one side from her pillow, her hands folded in front of her the way she folded them in church. She wasn't looking at me. She was looking at the paper in my hand, and her face had the particular stillness of someone who has been quietly terrified for longer than they've told anyone. "They said," she began, and her voice was so small I had to step toward her to hear it. They said it was only fair, Delia. They said your grandfather and I made them give up so much, raising you here, and that it was only fair we settle accounts before anything happens to me. I crossed the kitchen and took her hands. They were cold. Ruth's hands were never cold. She was a woman who ran warm, who'd press her palm to my forehead when I was a sick child, and her hand always felt like a heating pad. Grandma, I said carefully, how long have you had this? 11 days, she'd counted. Of course she'd counted. I didn't want to bother you. You work so hard. 11 days. For 11 days, my grandmother had been sitting alone in this house with a bill for $500,000 and a thinly veiled threat about her living arrangements. And she hadn't called me because she didn't want to bother me. I held her cold hands in my tired ones, and I made her a promise, and I meant it more than I have ever meant anything in my life. Nobody, I said, is going to put a price on you, not while I'm breathing. I didn't sleep that day. I had another shift in 20 hours, but I sat at Ruth's kitchen table instead, with the invoice in front of me and a cup of coffee going cold, and I made her tell me everything. It came out in pieces, the way things do when someone has been ashamed of being afraid. It had started about 4 months earlier, after my grandmother had a small stroke. Nothing dramatic, a TIA, a transient ischemic attack, the kind that scares everyone and resolves in a day. But it had landed her in the hospital overnight, and that, I realized later, was the moment my mother and stepfather smelled opportunity. An old woman, alone, with a paid-off house and a lifetime of careful savings, who had just been reminded of her own mortality. My mother, Connie, had started visiting more. That should have been a comfort. Connie had spent most of my childhood as a guest in my life rather than a fixture in it. She'd had me young, decided motherhood wasn't her calling, and left me with her parents while she found herself, which mostly meant finding a series of men, the last of whom was Greg. Now suddenly she was at Ruth's house twice a week, bringing grocery store flowers and using words like estate planning and getting your affairs in order. She was so kind about it, Ruth said, and the word kind came out bitter, which was not a flavor I was used to from my grandmother. She'd sit right there where you're sitting and she'd say, "Mama, we just want to make sure everything's taken care of. We just want to make sure there are no surprises." The thing about my grandmother is that she had spent her whole life being the person who took care, not the person who needed it. She'd been a seamstress for 50 years, the kind who could look at a torn hem and a customer's slumped shoulders and fix both. She didn't know how to be on the receiving end of someone deciding her fate, and Connie and Greg had counted on that. While Ruth talked, I noticed something. Her sewing box was open on the counter, and on top of the spools and pins sat her brass thimble, the old, worn one with the dented crown that she'd had since before I was born. She kept reaching over and turning it in her fingers while she spoke, the way some people worry a coin. "You still wear that thing?" I asked gently, trying to give her something to hold onto that wasn't fear. She smiled for the first time that morning. "I sew a little every day. Doctor said it's good for my hands." She rolled the thimble between her thumb and finger. "Your grandfather gave me this. First Christmas we were married, all he could afford. He said, 'Ruthie, a stitch counts even when no one sees it.' He meant the work. He meant you do it right whether anyone's watching or not. Whether anyone ever thanks you or not." She looked at the invoice on the table, then at me. "I suppose I always thought love was like that. You don't send a bill for it." I wrote that down in my head and didn't know yet how much I'd come back to it. That afternoon, my mother called. Ruth's phone rang on the wall, and I saw Connie's name, and I picked it up before Ruth could, and I held a finger to my lips. "Mama," Connie said, breezy, not knowing it was me, "did you look over the paperwork Greg left you? We really do need to get moving on this, the lawyer needs." "It's Delia," I said. There was a silence on the line, not a surprised silence, a calculating one. I had spent enough nights at bedsides reading the faces of people doing math about whether to tell the truth, and I could hear the same thing in my mother's pause. "Oh," she said finally. Her voice changed, went smooth and warm and completely false, like a coat of fresh paint over water damage. "Delia, sweetheart, I didn't know you were over there. Isn't it wonderful that you can spend time with Grandma?" "What is this invoice, Mom?" Now, don't get worked up. Don't get worked up, as if I were the one being unreasonable. This is a grown-up financial matter. Greg's looked at all the numbers, and the simple fact is your grandparents made certain choices about how you'd be raised, and those choices had costs, and we're at a point in life where those things need to be reconciled. It's nothing for you to worry your head about. Honestly, it doesn't even involve you. It doesn't even involve you. The bill for my childhood, the threat to my grandmother, addressed to settle the cost of me, and it didn't involve me. I'll come by this week, she went on, sweet as syrup. We'll sit down, all of us, and Greg will walk Mama through the payment options. There are several. We're being very fair. She hung up before I could answer. I stood there with the phone against my ear listening to the dial tone, and I looked at the brass thimble in my grandmother's hand, and I thought about a stitch that counts even when no one sees it. They had turned my grandmother's quiet, invisible love into a debt. They had taken the most uncounted thing in the world and put a number on it. I was going to make them regret learning how to count. To understand why that invoice felt like a knife and not just an insult, you have to understand who actually raised me. It wasn't my mother. I want to say that plainly, without bitterness, as a simple fact, the way I'd report a patient's history. Connie was 19 when she had me, and by the time I was 4, she had decided that her life and my life were two separate projects. She didn't abandon me in the dramatic sense. She just receded, the way a tide goes out and keeps going, until one day you look up and the water's so far away you can't remember it ever being close. It was Ruth who raised me. Ruth and my grandfather, Walter, until he passed when I was 10. I think about the things they did, and not one of them appears on any invoice, because the truest things never do. Ruth taught me to read at her kitchen table with cereal boxes and seed catalogs, because we couldn't always afford books. When I had pneumonia at 7, she sat up 3 nights straight with a damp cloth and a basin, and she sewed through the small hours so the lamp would be on if I woke up scared. She let out the seams of my school clothes so they'd last another year, and pretended she preferred the look. When I decided at 16 that I wanted to be a nurse, she took in extra alteration work, wedding dresses, mostly, hunched over them until midnight, and she never once told me how tired she was, and she paid for my first semester of prerequisites in cash she kept in an envelope inside her sewing box, beneath the spools, where she thought I didn't know. That's the woman they invoiced for general supervision and emotional labor. $66,000. As if you could put a number on a basin of cool water at 3 in the morning. My grandfather Walter was quieter even than Ruth. He'd been a machinist, careful with his hands and careful with money, the kind of man who balanced a checkbook to the penny and distrusted anyone who didn't. He died when I was 10, and I remember almost nothing about his finances. I was a child. But I remembered him sitting at that same table with a yellow legal pad, doing sums by hand, and once telling me, "Delia, when you can't trust people, you trust paper. Paper remembers." I didn't understand it then. I filed it away with all the other strange things adults say. Now, the antagonists. My mother, Connie Marsh-Hale, was the face of the operation, and she was good at it. She'd spent a lifetime learning to be charming on the surface in exactly the proportion she was absent underneath. She knew how to bring flowers and ask the right questions and make a frightened old woman feel that she was being helped right up until the moment the trap closed. She believed, I think, her own story, that she had sacrificed, that she was owed, that the universe had shortchanged her, and Ruth's savings were simply the correction. But Connie didn't make that invoice. Connie couldn't have itemized her way out of a paper bag. The numbers, the formatting, the cold legal language about reassessment of living arrangements, that was Greg. Gregory Hale had been a bookkeeper for 30 years for a string of small businesses, and he had the particular mind of a man who sees the world as columns. He was unfailingly polite to me, which was its own kind of warning. He called me Delia, dear, and shook my hand with both of his, and there was never anything in his eyes when he did it. He'd married my mother 8 years ago and folded smoothly into the family the way a card sharp folds into a friendly game. Here is the moment I knew, the moment that changed the shape of everything. It was the following Sunday. I'd taken time off, which I never do, and I was at Ruth's when Connie and Greg came by, the sit-down my mother had promised. Greg spread his papers on the table with the satisfaction of a man who loves his own competence. He walked Ruth through payment options in a low, reasonable voice, sliding a pen toward her, and I watched my grandmother's hands twist in her lap. I asked questions. Calm ones, nurse questions, the kind that don't sound like accusations. And at one point I asked, if Grandma doesn't have liquid assets, what exactly are you expecting her to pay with? And Greg, comfortable, certain, in command of his columns, said it without thinking. Well, that's the beauty of it. Once we access the trust, there's more than enough too. He stopped. He actually stopped mid-word, and I saw it land on his own face a half-second after it landed on mine. The trust. What trust? I said very evenly. Nothing, he said, a figure of speech. But it wasn't a figure of speech. Bookkeepers do not say access the trust as a figure of speech. And my mother had gone pale and was staring at her husband with the expression of a woman watching someone drop a glass in slow motion. I noticed two other things in that visit, now that I was looking. First, Ruth's mail was different. There was a forwarding sticker on a couple of envelopes on the side table, redirecting to Greg's address. They'd been intercepting her mail. Second, when Ruth mentioned that her friend Marjorie from church had been trying to reach her, Connie said quickly, too quickly. Oh, we told Marjorie you weren't up to visitors right now, Mama. You need your rest. They were closing the doors around her one by one. They thought they had an isolated, frightened old woman and a tired nurse granddaughter who didn't understand money. They had no idea that my grandfather had told me, 20 years before, that paper remembers, and that I had just heard the word trust fall out of the wrong man's mouth. I didn't say anything else about the trust that Sunday. That was the hardest thing I've ever done, to sit there with that word burning in my chest and let Greg believe he'd covered it up. But I've learned something in the ICU that most people never learn. The most powerful thing you can do is let people keep underestimating you. A patient who thinks the monitor isn't watching, a family member who thinks you don't notice the missing pills, you learn more from what people do when they think no one's reading the chart. So I smiled, and I told Greg the numbers were a lot to take in. And I said maybe Grandma should rest, and I walked them to the door, and my mother kissed my cheek with lips like paper, and I waved from the porch until their car was gone. Then I went back inside, and I sat down across from my grandmother, and I changed. I want to be honest about that change because it's the heart of this whole thing. For 11 days plus that week, I had been a frightened granddaughter. A daughter still, somewhere, hoping her mother wasn't really doing this. That Sunday evening, I stopped being any of those things. I became something colder and more useful. I became a person reading a chart. Grandma, I said, did Grandpa ever set up a trust? She blinked at me. A trust? That's lawyer talk, Delia. We weren't lawyer people. Did he ever have a lawyer, even once, even a long time ago? She thought about it for a long moment, her thumb finding the brass thimble on the table out of habit. There was a man, she said slowly, before he passed. Walter went into town a few times, all dressed up, wouldn't say why. He hated a fuss. I asked him and he said, Ruthie, I'm making sure the girl is taken care of no matter what. I thought he meant his life insurance. There was a little policy. She frowned, but he kept papers. Walter kept everything. Where, I said, where did he keep papers? In his cabinet, in the workshop. I never touched it after he died. It didn't feel right. Her eyes filled. It's all still out there. I couldn't bring myself to clean it out. The workshop was a detached garage at the back of the property, and I'd avoided it my whole adult life because it still smelled like my grandfather, like cutting oil and sawdust, and a person I missed. I went out there that night with a flashlight, and I found his cabinet, a gray steel thing locked with a little key that Ruth kept, after all those years, in a teacup in the kitchen. Paper remembers, he'd said. He hadn't only meant it as advice. He'd meant it as a plan. The cabinet was full of folders, each labeled in his small, precise machinist's handwriting. Tax returns going back decades. The deed to the house, paid in full. The life insurance policy, which had long since paid out. And at the very back, in a folder labeled simply 4DLIA, a document on heavy paper with a law firm's name embossed at the top. The Walter J. Marsh Irrevocable Trust. I sat down on the cold concrete floor of my grandfather's workshop, and I read it 3 times, and then I had to put my head between my knees because the room was spinning. I'm a nurse, not a lawyer. But I read carefully for a living, and the language, once I slowed down, was not actually that complicated. My grandfather had taken the proceeds of a small inheritance and a chunk of his savings, modest by Greg's Invoice standards, but real, and 25 years ago he had put it into an irrevocable trust. Irrevocable. It could not be undone, not by Connie, not by Greg, not by anyone. The trust named my grandmother, Ruth, as the lifetime beneficiary. The funds existed to provide for her care and security for the rest of her life, and it named a successor trustee to manage and protect the trust on Ruth's behalf. Me, Delia Marsh. Named in a document signed when I was 3 years old by a man who, 2 decades before any of this, had looked at his careless daughter and his frightened wife and his small granddaughter, and decided to build a wall around the people he loved that no one could climb. There was a letter, too, handwritten, folded into the folder. Just a few lines. Delia, if you're reading this, you're grown and I'm gone and something's gone wrong, because otherwise the lawyer would have handled it quiet. Take care of your grandmother. The money's hers to live on, not anyone's to take. You were always the one who paid attention. That's why it's you. Grandpa. I'd thought, walking out to that workshop, that I might find leverage. I hadn't expected to find a man reaching across 18 years from beyond the grave to tell me he'd been counting on me all along. Here is what I understood, sitting on that floor. Greg knew about this trust. That was the slip. Somehow, probably through the same intercepted mail, some statement or notice that should have gone to Ruth, Greg had discovered the trust existed. His entire plan depended on it. The $475,000 invoice was never really about an old debt. It was a tool to frighten and pressure my grandmother into authorizing access to the trust funds to pay the bill, to make her hand over the very money my grandfather had hidden to protect her. They didn't want to bill Ruth. They wanted to drain her. And the one thing standing between them and that money was a clause in a 25-year-old document naming me trustee, a clause they had no idea I'd ever find. The next morning, I called the law firm embossed at the top of the page. It still existed. The original attorney had retired, but his successor, a sharp, soft-spoken woman named Patricia Acaffer, pulled the file while I was on hold and came back with a different tone in her voice than the one she'd answered with. MS. Marsh, she said, this trust is valid, it is funded, and it is, frankly, airtight. Your grandfather was very careful. May I ask why, after 25 years, you're calling about it now? So I told her about the invoice, about the intercepted mail, about the isolation, about a man who said access the trust and then said it was a figure of speech. There was a long pause. Ms. Marsh, Patricia Acaffer said, what you're describing has a name. It's called financial elder abuse, and the fact that it involves an attempt to access protected trust assets makes it considerably more serious than your mother and stepfather seem to understand. I think you and I should meet. And I think you should bring everything in that cabinet. I could have gone straight to the police or straight to a lawsuit, but I wanted 2 things first that the law couldn't give me. I wanted my grandmother safe, and I wanted my mother to look me in the eye and lie one more time so that there could never be any doubt, not in my mind, not in Ruth's, about who these people were. Patricia helped me with the first part fast. Within a week, working with Ruth's signature and full, eager consent, we did several quiet things. We formally notified the bank holding the trust that I, the named successor trustee, was now active, which froze any possibility of Greg maneuvering near it. We stopped the mail forwarding and had Ruth's mail locked to her address only. And Patricia drafted a simple letter on her firm's letterhead that I kept folded in my pocket for the right moment. The right moment came when Connie called, impatient, 4 days before the invoice's 60-day deadline. Delia, we cannot keep waiting on this. Greg says if Mama doesn't sign the payment authorization this week, we'll have no choice but to involve the courts about her capacity to live independently. We don't want to do that. But she clearly can't manage her own affairs. She's got a $500,000 obligation and no plan to meet it. There it was. The real threat, finally fully out of the bag. Pay us, or we'll have her declared incompetent and take over everything. I felt something go very still and clear inside me, the way it does at a bedside when a patient crashes and the panic burns off and there's only the work. Come over Saturday, I said. Both of you, bring all your paperwork. Grandma and I want to settle this. The word settle did exactly what I knew it would. I heard my mother's voice warm with triumph. Saturday, they arrived in their good clothes, Greg with his leather folder, Connie with a bakery box like she was visiting for a birthday. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where she'd taught me to read, where the Invoice had sat for 11 days. Ruth sat beside me with her hands folded and her thimble in her pocket. I'd asked her to let me talk. Greg laid out his payment authorization form, all business. Now, Ruth, what we'll do is. Before we do anything, I said pleasantly, I want to make sure I understand the numbers, Greg. You're billing my grandmother $475,000. And when I asked how she's supposed to pay it, you mentioned a trust. Remember? The room temperature dropped about 10 degrees. I told you, Greg said, that was a figure of speech. It's funny, I said, because I went looking for that figure of speech. I reached down and laid my grandfather's trust document on the table, turned so they could read the title. The Walter J. Marsh Irrevocable Trust. I have never in my life seen two faces change so fast. My mother's mouth opened. Greg's hand twitched toward the document and then stopped, because some part of his bookkeeper brain knew not to touch it. You knew about this, I said to him. That's the whole plan, isn't it? You found out Grandpa left a trust to take care of Grandma for life. You can't touch an irrevocable trust from the outside. But you could scare a frightened old woman into authorizing payment of a debt out of it. So you invented a debt. You priced out my childhood like a kitchen remodel so you'd have a number big enough to require the trust to pay it. I tilted my head. How am I doing? And then Greg made his mistake, the one I'd hoped for. He didn't deny it. He pivoted to threat because men like Greg, when cornered, reach for the same hammer that always worked before. That trust, he said, low, leaning forward, needs a trustee, and given Ruth's condition and your obvious emotional bias, I'd think very carefully, Delia, about. It does need a trustee, I agreed. I took Patricia's letter out of my pocket and unfolded it and set it on top of the trust. Successor trustee, named in the document. Activated 9 days ago. That's me, Greg. I let him read the firm's letterhead. The bank's already been notified. You can't get within a mile of that money. You never could. You just didn't know it yet. My mother started to cry. Real tears, I think, though with Connie it was always impossible to tell where the performance ended. Delia, how could you go behind our backs like this, your own family? We were only trying to help. Help, I repeated. Everything we did for her, she gestured at Ruth. And my grandmother spoke for the first time. Quietly, the way she said everything so that you had to lean in, which meant everyone always did. Connie, she said, I sat in this house for 11 days afraid you were going to take my home, my own daughter. She took the brass thimble out of her pocket and set it on the table next to the invoice, two small objects side by side. Your father gave me this the year we married. He told me a stitch counts even when no one sees it. He spent his whole life making sure you and Delia were taken care of whether anyone thanked him or not. She looked at the invoice. And you sent me a bill, for love. You put a number on it because you've never once understood that it doesn't have one. It was the only time I ever heard Ruth raise her voice, and she didn't even raise it much. But Connie flinched like she'd been struck, and for 1 second, I think my mother actually saw herself. Then Greg gathered his folder and the second passed, and they left without another word. But the spell, whatever spell my mother had been under or had been casting, had a crack in it now. I could see it, and I intended to break it the rest of the way. They didn't give up. People like Greg never give up when the only thing they respect is leverage. They just look for new leverage. Over the next 2 weeks, the pressure changed shape. First came a letter from a lawyer, not Greg's usual amateur work, but a real attorney's office, stating their intent to petition for guardianship of Ruth on the grounds that she was vulnerable and being unduly influenced by a family member with control over her assets. They had flipped it. They were going to accuse me of being the elder abuser. It was almost clever. A frightened, confused old woman, suddenly under the financial control of a granddaughter who'd activated herself as trustee, to a stranger, it could be made to look exactly backward. I'd be lying if I said it didn't scare me. The night that letter came, I sat in my car outside the hospital before my shift and shook for 10 minutes. Because the thing about people who weaponize systems is that the systems don't always know who's lying. But here's what Greg, master of columns, had forgot: paper remembers. And I had more paper than he did. I went back to Patricia Ackafer, and this time I brought everything, not just the trust, but the whole picture, assembled the way I'd assemble a patient history, every symptom in order. And then I did something Greg never imagined the tired nurse would do. I built a case. I went to the bank, and, as trustee, with full legal right, I pulled the records. And there it was, the digital fingerprints of someone who'd been inquiring about the trust account for months. Greg had called the bank twice, posing as a family financial representative, trying to learn the balance and the access terms. The bank had logged both calls. He'd left a paper trail looking for the money long before any invoice existed, which destroyed the entire premise that the bill was a good faith debt. I tracked down the intercepted mail. The forwarding order had Greg's signature on it. He'd forged a request to redirect a 79-year-old woman's mail to his own address. That's not a gray area, that's a federal crime. And then there was Marjorie, the church friend Connie had turned away. I called her. It turned out Marjorie had been worried for months and had even kept a little notebook, the way careful older women do, of the times she'd called Ruth and been told by Connie or Greg that Ruth couldn't come to the phone or wasn't up to visitors. Documented isolation, dated and detailed, from an independent witness with no stake in the trust. But the piece that broke it open came from the past. Patricia, doing her own diligence, found that Greg's history didn't start with us. He'd been a bookkeeper for a string of small businesses, yes. And at one of them, 11 years earlier, before he ever met my mother, there had been a quiet civil settlement. An elderly business owner's family had accused Greg of irregularities in the company accounts during the man's final illness, of moving money he shouldn't have moved while the owner was too sick to notice. It never went criminal. The family settled to avoid a fight, and Greg moved on and married a woman whose mother happened to have a paid-off house and a careful husband's savings. He wasn't a man who'd made one terrible choice with us. He was a man who'd done this before. We were just the next elderly account on his ledger. When I laid all of it out on Patricia's conference table, the trust, the bank inquiry logs, the forged forwarding order, Marjorie's notebook, the prior settlement, Patricia looked at it for a long time and then sat back. MS. Marsh, she said, they filed for guardianship to put you on the defensive. They have no idea what you've assembled. When they see this, that petition isn't going to survive the week. The question is what you want. She folded her hands. You can settle this quietly, or you can put all of it in front of them and the authorities in one room and end it for good. I thought about my grandmother sitting alone for 11 days, counting. I thought about a forged signature on an old woman's mail. I thought about a man who had done this before and would do it again to someone else's grandmother if no one stopped him. I want to end it for good, I said. All of it, in one room. Patricia almost smiled. Then let's bring everyone to the table. Patricia's office was on the 11th floor of a quiet building downtown, all glass and gray carpet, and the particular hush of a place where serious things get decided. We held the meeting under the banner of resolving the guardianship petition and the outstanding financial matter. That was the language in the letter Patricia sent, deliberately mild, designed to make Connie and Greg believe they were coming to negotiate from strength. I'd thought a long time about whether to make this a public spectacle, a family dinner, a scene, the kind of explosion that feels good for a moment. But that wasn't who my grandfather was, and it wasn't who I wanted to become. Walter Marsh hadn't protected his family with shouting. He'd protected them with a document, signed quietly, that waited 25 years to do its work. I wanted to end it the way he would have, calmly, on paper. Final. There were 6 of us at the table. Patricia and me on one side, with Ruth between us in her good blue dress, her hands folded, the brass thimble, I knew, in her pocket. Across from us, Connie and Greg with their own attorney, a tired-looking man named Burns who clearly had no idea what his clients had actually done. And at the end of the table, by my request, sat one more person, a woman named Detective Alvarez from the Financial Crimes Unit, whom Patricia had quietly briefed in advance. Connie and Greg had not been told she'd be there. When they walked in and saw her, Greg's step hitched, just slightly, the way a man's does when he hears a sound he can't place. Burns opened, smooth and confident, talking about Ruth's vulnerability and his clients, good faith concern, and the appropriateness of a neutral guardian. He'd been fed a story, and he believed it, and I almost felt sorry for him. When he finished, Patricia thanked him politely. Then she slid a folder across the table to him. "Before your clients proceed with the guardianship petition," she said, "they should understand what's already on the record. Mr. Burns, please take a moment." And then, one item at a time, in the flat, unhurried voice of someone reading a chart, I went through it. I didn't gloat. I want you to know that. I had imagined, in the angry days, savoring it. But when the moment came, there was no pleasure in it, only a kind of grim precision, like setting a broken bone. I laid down the trust. 25 years old, irrevocable, Ruth the beneficiary, me the named successor trustee. "This is the money my mother and stepfather have been trying to reach," I said. "It is legally untouchable by them. It always was." I laid down the bank's call logs. These are records of Mr. Hale contacting the bank twice, identifying himself as a family financial representative, attempting to learn the trust's balance and access terms. These calls were made before the invoice was ever created. Burns turned a page. His confidence was draining out of his face like water out of a cracked basin. I laid down the forwarding order with Greg's signature, and beside it a sample of his actual signature for comparison. This redirected my grandmother's mail to Mr. Hale's home address. She never authorized it. Detective Alvarez can speak to what forging a mail forwarding request constitutes. Detective Alvarez spoke 2 words: a felony. I laid down Marjorie's notebook, photocopied, dated entries of every time my grandmother had been kept from her friends. "Documented isolation," I said, "by an independent witness." And then last, I laid down the records of the prior settlement, the other elderly business owner, the other family, the other quiet money moved by the same careful hands 11 years before any of us. "You've done this before," I said to Greg, not loudly. We were just the next account. The room was very quiet. Burns set down the folder, removed his glasses, and looked at his clients in a way that told me he was already mentally writing his withdrawal from the case. My mother had gone gray. She turned to me, and I watched her reach, one last time, for the only tool she'd ever had, the warm voice, the wounded eyes. "Delia," she whispered. "You don't understand," Greg said it would be. I never wanted to hurt her. But it was Greg I was watching, and Greg, finally, understood that the columns had been balanced against him by someone he'd dismissed. He didn't rage. That was the chilling part. He simply went still and silent and began, very slightly, to gather his papers, the reflex of a man who has been caught before and knows the next part by heart. And then my grandmother spoke. She'd been silent the whole time, small between Patricia and me. Now she took the brass thimble out of her pocket and set it on the table, on top of everything, on top of the trust and the logs and the forged order, this little dented piece of brass worth almost nothing and everything. "Walter knew," she said, looking at her daughter. 25 years ago, he knew. He didn't tell me because he didn't want me to be afraid. He just made sure." Her voice didn't shake. "I spent my whole life thinking I was the one taking care of everyone. And the whole time, he was taking care of me, quiet, the way he did everything." She closed her hand briefly over the thimble. "A stitch counts even when no one sees it, Connie. He saw you, he loved you, and he still knew exactly what you'd become." Connie put her face in her hands. It wasn't a triumphant scene. There was no applause, no shouting, no satisfying explosion. There was just a frightened old woman finally unafraid, a daughter realizing she had been seen clearly by a dead man 25 years before she revealed herself, and a careful criminal quietly putting his papers in order while a detective watched. It was the quietest victory I can imagine, and it was complete. The guardianship petition was withdrawn within 48 hours. Burns wanted nothing more to do with it, or with his clients. What I'd assembled didn't stay in that conference room. Detective Alvarez took the forged forwarding order, the bank logs, and the prior settlement and built them into something far beyond a family dispute. Greg was charged, financial elder abuse, attempted exploitation of a protected trust, mail fraud for the forged forwarding order. The 11-year-old settlement, dug up and dusted off, became the pattern that turned an isolated incident into a story a prosecutor could tell a jury. He took a plea in the end, the way careful men do when the columns no longer add up in their favor. A felony conviction, restitution, probation with conditions that barred him from any fiduciary role over another person's finances ever again. The thing he was, a man who managed other people's money, was taken from him permanently. For a man like Greg, that was its own kind of ruin. My mother was never charged. The evidence pointed overwhelmingly at Greg as the architect, and Connie, in the end, was what she'd always been, not the planner, but the willing front, the charm laid over someone else's machine. The law let her go. But Ruth didn't. That's the part people find hardest, I think, when I tell this story. My grandmother did not have a tearful, sweeping reconciliation with her daughter. There was no scene on a porch with rain and forgiveness. What happened was quieter, and I've come to believe healthier. Ruth simply, finally, set a boundary she should have been allowed to set 50 years earlier. "I don't hate her," Ruth told me, a few weeks after, while we sat at her kitchen table, that table with good coffee for once because I'd bought a real machine. "She's my daughter. I'll always love her. But I'm 79 years old, Delia, and I am done being afraid in my own house. She isn't welcome here. Not until she's a different person than the one who sent me that bill, and I don't expect to live long enough to see it." She said it without bitterness, which somehow made it heavier. That's not anger, that's just the truth, finally. Connie tried, twice, the warm voice on the phone. Ruth listened and was kind and said no and hung up and went back to her sewing. There's a particular strength in a gentle person who has finally learned the word no, and it is unshakable in a way that loud people never manage. As for me, I'm still a pediatric ICU nurse. I still work nights. The trust does what my grandfather built it to do. It keeps Ruth secure for the rest of her life, pays for the in-home help she'd never have asked for, took the fear of money out of her days. I manage it the way he'd have wanted, to the penny, and every time I balance it, I think of a quiet man at this table with a yellow legal pad telling a 10-year-old that paper remembers. He'd been right about everything. He'd been right that I was the one who paid attention. He'd been right that something would go wrong, and that paper, signed quietly and waiting patiently, would be there when it did. He reached across 18 years of being gone and protected his wife with a document and his granddaughter with a single sentence of trust, and I will spend the rest of my life trying to deserve the way he saw me. Ruth gave me the thimble, the little dented brass one. I keep it on the windowsill above my sink, and most days I don't think about any of this at all. But sometimes, after a hard shift, I'll hold it, and I'll remember that the truest things never show up on any invoice. The basin of cool water at 3 in the morning, the let-out seams, the cash in the envelope under the spools, the quiet man making sure. A stitch counts even when no one sees it. They tried to put a price on my grandmother's love. They learned, the hard way, that the things worth the most were the ones they never knew how to count.